In this video, I'm going to be going through the resume that you see on the screen right now right in front of you and giving you a quick overview of everything that's included here, how you might use this in your own recruiting efforts, and why I think you should be using the formats here and use some of the structure here and try to incorporate it as much as possible into your own resume. Now, the first thing to point out is that this is for a university student, so that explains certain things on here, such as the education section right here being at the top. We have work and leadership experience next right here, and then we have the skills, activities, and interests here at the bottom. Now, if you are not a student, then this would be structured differently, but we're just going to focus on what university students have to take into account. The first thing to note here is that there's not that much information on this resume. It's probably less than some of the samples that you've seen before, and that is done intentionally because with investment resumes, you only have about 30 seconds or so for the person to read it and for you to catch their attention. So they're not going to be spending too much time reading it. You really need to focus on the key points and draw their attention to those rather than giving them a laundry list of everything that you've done over the past 10 years, especially if you're still a student and you don't have any full-time work experience. So the margins here are set to 3/4 of an inch, which is reasonable. I would not go too much below 1/2 inch on the margins. The font size is 12. We're just using Times New Roman. It doesn't really matter what font you're using as long as it's readable. You could use Arial, could use a number of other fonts. The main important point to keep in mind here is that it has to be readable above all else. So I like Times New Roman and Arial, but feel free to use anything that is readable. Now, if these margins and this 12-point font size are too big for your resume and you can't fit everything on for some reason, you can decrease the font size. It's probably better to decrease the font size rather than decreasing the margins because decreasing the margins tends to make the resume very, very difficult to read. Whereas if we change the font size here to 10 or 8 or something like that, then it would be more difficult to read, but it's still better than making non-existent margins, for example. Now, in terms of the actual sections here, you'll see that we start off with the header right here. Then we go right into education, then to work and leadership experience, and then into skills, activities, and interests. The header should be very, very simple. Just have your name, your physical address, your phone number, and your email address laid out like this. Now, for your name, you should try to include this in larger font than the rest of the items on your resume, just so it stands out and so whoever is looking at it will actually remember who you are. It sounds minor, but it's actually a pretty good idea to do this, and it's not going to give you a huge advantage, but it's just something you should try to do on yours, assuming you have enough space to do so. The rest of it should be kept pretty simple, and there's not too much to add here. Of course, make sure that your email address actually works. Make sure your phone number actually works. I've seen cases where people have listed out-of-date information or phone numbers that don't work anymore. For your email address, try to list a .edu address if you're still in school. You could list Gmail or Yahoo or something like that, but it's generally better to list .edu just so they know, just so they can look at it at a glance and tell, okay, this person is definitely still in school. They have this legitimate .edu address. If you're a recent graduate or you're about to graduate, then listing Gmail or some kind of other web-based account is fine here. Now moving down into education, a couple of points to make here. So first off, notice how I've laid this out where the university name and then the name of your major are left aligned right here, and then the location, so the city followed by the state if you're in the US or the country if you're abroad, are right aligned, and then the expected graduation date is also right aligned. So I'm going to show you how I did that because I get a lot of questions about this. So the way to do that is to highlight everything. I'm pressing the shift key and pressing the down arrow after I press the right arrow right here. And then I'm going to go to styles. This is in Word 2007, so it looks a bit different in Word 2003, but you basically just go to styles, regardless of which version you're using. The interface is a bit different, but you basically just go to styles, regardless of the version you're using. And we'll click there, and here we already have our style, resume align right set up. But if we did not have that, I would go to new style here at the bottom. Then we can name it. We'll just call this test format. And you see that we're basically starting with these properties of Times New Roman size 12 font. Then we'll go to format here at the bottom and go to tabs. Then what we want to do here is press clear all and then set our tab stop position to 7 inches because that's where the end of the page is in this case. That's where our last margin is. We'll select right for the alignment and then press OK. So now what we've done is made it so that this style that we've entered, this new style, you'll see that the formatting is a bit messed up now, but the new style that we created here basically makes it so that whenever you press the tab key, you automatically go to the end right here. So that's how you set that up. And I'm bringing this up just because I get a lot of questions about how to do this. And on some of the sample resumes I've given before, people have asked me how to create this. So it's pretty simple, but the Word documentation doesn't exactly make it easy to find it. Now, for the education section also, so after you list all this information, you definitely need to include your GPA or some kind of grading system if you're outside the US. If you're in the UK, for example, you'd be listing it using their scale. So you might list 2.1 here, or say that you earned a cumulative 2.1 average through all your courses. SAT is more optional. I would only list this if it's above 1400 or 2100 in the new system. And on GPA, even if you perceive that your GPA is low or bad, as in below, say, 3.5, you should still list it here, because if you don't include it, then they'll assume it's really bad, as in 2.0 or below. So you want to include this unless it's absolutely terrible, and even if it is, you probably still want to include it in some form. Now, if it is low, you can sort of disguise it by including your major GPA as well. So right here, you could say major GPA, and hopefully that's higher than your overall cumulative GPA. You could also list something like second year GPA or junior year GPA, and that's if you've shown a strong trend of improvement. That's a bit more of a stretch, so I would probably not do that unless you have a really unusual situation. Usually the safer best bet is to just show your major GPA right here. Now honors, I would probably not list something as common as Dean's List here, but you can if you want to and you have the space. This is probably better used for actual university-wide recognition that's uncommon. Then for relevant coursework, if you have anything business related, especially if your major is not in business or finance, so if you're an art history major or an English major, then it's good to list that kind of coursework here, so that way someone looking at it can quickly tell that you've done something business or finance related and that you at least know the basics of that. A couple other points here. You could also list study abroad experience. So right here, I would probably include this as a separate entry. So study abroad experience, and we could have city, country, and just write a very simple description here. So you could say completed intensive language study and internship, something like that. And then you could just list start date and end date right here. So that would be one way you could list your study abroad experience. High school should not be included in this section, with a few exceptions. There are some regions where it's more acceptable to include that type of information, so you have to kind of play it by ear and see what your friends are doing, see what other people are doing. But in general, if you're in the US and you're already a second year, third year, fourth year student at university, then you really should not be including that. Maybe if you just arrived at college and you don't really have any experience yet, then high school might be worth including, but I would not keep it on here for very long. Also make sure that you don't include clubs, activities, or interests, or certifications, or anything like that here. I've seen some cases where people list training programs in the education section right here. Sometimes they list student activities or groups right here, but in general you shouldn't do that. Those should really be saved for the work and leadership experience section right here, and then for skills, activities, and interests here at the end. So now to move into this work and leadership experience section. So you'll notice here that I have three entries. One for this one, presumably an internship or some kind of school year part-time internship at a company, and then this is for another one, and then this last one here at the end is for a student group or activity. In general for this section, I think it's a good idea to aim for between 2 and 4 different work experience entries. So maybe you had 2 internships at an asset management firm, or you worked at a boutique bank and then at a consulting firm. Those should both be written about here. And maybe you were involved heavily with a student group, or you founded a business fraternity or some kind of investment club. Then those would all be good candidates to write about here. Don't try to do a laundry list of 17 different activities or work experiences that you've had here, because it's just going to backfire. You really want to focus on the key ones, and everyone understands that you've been involved with a lot of different things, but from the perspective of someone reviewing your resume, they only have 15, 20, 30 seconds, so you have to really hit on the key points. Now, one mistake I've seen people make in this section a lot is they've had an internship at Goldman Sachs, for example, and they've also been involved with 5 student clubs, and they'll go in and spend the same amount of space on those 5 student clubs as they will on Goldman Sachs. Well, if you have that kind of name on your resume, that needs to be the focus. That should be taking up at least half of your section right here. And that applies, by the way, even if you've done some kind of back or middle office internship, because the name alone is going to carry a lot of weight when whoever's reading your resume sees it. So use common sense and think about what a recruiter at an investment bank or just an investment banker reviewing your resume is going to be most concerned with. In general, they don't care too much about student activities and clubs unless you've done something truly extraordinary. Maybe if it's something you've been heavily involved with or something you founded, it's good to include. But for the most part, they're very, very focused on your internships and your work experience, whether that's full time if you're a recent graduate or maybe a school year part time internship or something of that nature. Another point here is that I've grouped together work and leadership experience. So these first 2 entries are for work experience, and this last one is for a student club. Now, I recommend that you do this unless you're in a situation where, say, you have 2 work experiences that you were heavily involved with, 2 solid internships working in consulting and private equity or something along those lines, hedge funds, prop trading firms, something like that. And then you've also had 2 student groups that you've been very, very actively involved with. In that case, it may be worth it to split this off into 2 separate sections, but do keep in mind that it's going to take up more space. So think about how much space you have on your resume, how much you really have to say there, and make a decision based on that. But in general, I think it's a better idea to actually leave these grouped together. Now, if you haven't really had any formal internships or other work experience, it's still a good idea to title this section Work and Leadership Experience, and then you can just put all your activities here or your research experience or something like that right here. And what you're doing then is by labeling it Work and Leadership Experience, you make it seem like it was closer to work experience. So you're not lying because in a sense it was work, especially if it was something outside a student club. Something like a research internship that was unpaid is sort of work experience. So you're not really lying about it, but you're making it seem like it was closer to work than it actually was. Now, if we look at the specific types of entries here, we see that there are basically 2 formats. And this first one is what I call the project-centric format, where we have a summary sentence at the beginning, and then we have client, project, transaction experience right here. And this format, where you go into the specific projects that you worked on, is most appropriate for a professional services field. So I'll just make a note of it right here. Investment banking, consulting, private equity, asset management, equity research, accounting, law, anything like that in those professional services fields is ideal for this because you work with specific clients on specific projects, transactions, investments. So that's what you should be using for this. Now, if you don't have something in those fields, you can still use this format, but you have to be careful about what you do and how you apply it and make sure that you can actually speak to these specific projects that you worked on. In general, you should try to pick, again, I'd say between 2 and 4 different projects or clients to speak to right here. Listing more than that gets into laundry list territory where you're just giving them too much information. If you only list 1 here, it looks a little odd if we were to only have, for example, this project 1 right here, because you're saying selected and you're only listing 1. So it looks better to list at least 2 or 3 right here. Now, if you're writing about this and you've worked at an investment bank, then you might title this something like Technology Companies $500 million acquisition of software company, let's say. If you're working in private equity, then maybe you'll title this Potential Investment in $1 billion manufacturing company, and so on and so forth. Similarly, in consulting, let's say, you might title this something like Fortune 500 companies internal restructuring advisory or something like that. That's actually, you probably wouldn't see this in consulting, but this is just to give you a couple different ideas and examples for how you might title these sections. You should avoid naming specific company or client names here unless it's for a transaction that has already been announced and is publicly known. It's just a bad idea. Just avoid doing it and describe it by industry. So technology company, pharmaceutical company, manufacturing company instead. And then this one here at the bottom is in a slightly different format, which is what I call the task or responsibility centric format. And it's actually not that much different. The only difference really is that you're not listing out specific projects, you're organizing your what you did by tasks instead. So this works well for research type positions, it works well for engineering, for something that's not in professional services. This works well for student clubs because I'm using it right here as well. So these are the two basic formats. If you can, you should try to use this format, especially when applying to investment banks, but it's not absolutely essential, and if it's a stretch, then don't do it. Also, feel free to mix and match these two formats. So you might have, for example, right here, instead of just this one summary sentence, you might have bullets 2, 3, and 4 right here, and you might just go into more detail on some of what you did in your internship. So feel free to mix and match these. You don't need to stick rigidly to what I'm suggesting here. This is just to generate ideas and give you some idea of how to structure your own experience. Now, the next thing here is to go into the specific structure of the bullets. So you'll see here, and you probably already have an idea of how to do it based on what I've written here, that I have as the sample language led team to do XX, which resulted in more efficiency, time or money saved, or higher sales. And basically what you want to do with each bullet is list the specifics first. So here we might say led team to create online marketing campaign for new product targeted at small businesses, which resulted in 35% higher monthly sales. We could even make this better by saying led team of 12 right there to create online marketing campaign. Then we could be more specific and say maybe this was some kind of software or online software company. We'll call this new accounting product, for example. So what we really want to do here are name as many numbers as we can. So team of 12, 35% higher monthly sales, and be as specific as we can be with the results as well. And this isn't always possible to do. I know in a lot of cases you just won't know the results of your internship or whatever kind of experience you had. And if you don't, that's fine. It's not critical, but if you can list anything there, anything at all, then it's much better than nothing. And by results, you don't need to have anything that's too fancy. So if we were writing about an investment banking internship, for example, we might say company A's $200 million acquisition of company B. We could say something like research potential buyers for client based on financial profiles, geographies, and management teams. Analysis led to client proceeding with further due diligence. Now, that's not really a quantifiable result. You're just saying that your work led the client in the direction of going ahead with the transaction, but it's still better than nothing because you're showing that the due diligence you did, the research you did, led somewhere in that case. But those are the basics of how you should be writing about that kind of experience and structuring your bullets. And the same, by the way, applies even for student clubs, activities, or anything else where you're using the task-based structure instead. You want to focus really on the specific, you really want to focus on the specifics of what you did and then the results. It doesn't matter what order it's in. So, for example, you might be able to say raised over $200,000 for student-run investment club by managing campaign to reach out to over 1,000 alumni in financial services industry. So in this case, we have our result first, followed by this by structure by managing campaign to reach out to over 1,000 alumni. So the specific order doesn't matter too much. Just make sure you try to include both of those, the specifics and the results, if at all possible. Now moving on to skills, activities, and interests here at the bottom, there are a couple of things to point out. This section should be kept very simple. I would say no more than 5 or 6 lines maybe at most for this, unless you have some really unusual experience. Languages should always be listed here, especially if you're a native speaker in anything. Do not list fluent in English here, especially if your resume is in English. because they kind of assume that if your resume is in English, then you probably know the language. So don't include that here. Only include fluency in non-English languages. Technical skills are good to include, especially any programming languages. Even something like VBA could be included here. Photoshop, web design, things like that. You could still list. They're not particularly helpful for banking, but if you want to and you feel you've spent a lot of time on those, you have really good skills, go ahead and list them. Certifications and training. So here's where you put any classes, programs, or additional training that you've done outside of work and outside of school. Then activities, anything that was more minor where you didn't really have a leadership role, anything that didn't take up too much of your time would go down here. And then interests. Try to be as specific as you can here without going overboard. So, for example, don't just say running. If you've competed in marathons in a couple different countries, you should be writing about that. Say competing in marathons in 12 different countries rather than just saying that you're interested in running or long distance running. If you have interests that are more unusual, they should definitely be highlighted here because they'll remember you. So let's say that you've gone hang gliding in Brazil or something like that. Well, you definitely want to note that here because that's extremely uncommon and not that many people are going to have that here. So try to list more uncommon interests just so the interviewer or whoever's looking at your resume can look at this and quickly get an idea of who you are and then remember you later on when they're picking who they want to give interviews to. So that's pretty much it for this overview of how to structure your investment banking resume if you're still a university student. Of course, you don't have to stick exactly to this format. Feel free to modify the font, the formatting, whatever you want, but I do think the overall framework of focusing on 2 to 4 major work experiences as I do here, and then sort of going in and giving a summary sentence for each one, and then going into maybe the 2, 3, or 4 major responsibilities you had, the results, if you had something in banking or consulting or even accounting or law or something like that, going into the specific projects or clients you work with, if at all possible, would be good strategies to follow on your own resume. So that's it for our overview of the university student. Coming up in future videos in this series, we'll be going into resume templates that older, more experienced people at the MBA level or even beyond might be using. And then we'll go into some specific examples of actual sample resumes and how we might revise them and make them better to improve your chances of actually getting interviews.